Okay guys, so in today's video I'm going to show you how I set up this vivarium. I'm not going to disclose what it's for yet, but before we get into it I'd like to give a massive thank you to DMS Vivaria for sending me the enclosure and to Skylight for the lighting, but without further ado, let's crack on with the build. Now, just as a quick interjection, if you're interested in finding out all of the equipment I used in this enclosure, then do check out the video I will link in the top right hand corner of the screen right now, because I made this video last week when I got all this stuff in an online order, and I do talk about everything that I've got in, so if you're planning to do this yourself, that will be a good place to start. So once I had all of the equipment to hand, the first part of the process was to flip the vivarium on its back and then decide where I wanted to put the cork, which is going to make up the background. I spent a very long time doing this because once you've got it in place, you can't move it again, so it's definitely something you want to take your time doing. After a while, I settled on this for the arrangement of the cork on the back side of the enclosure. With the layout of the cork decided upon, it was time to stick it into place. To do this, I'm using the marine grade silicone sealant because you definitely want to have it sort of safe for fish so that it's not going to give off anything that could be dangerous for reptiles or amphibians. And you also want to make sure that you stick a good load on, because otherwise at a later date you do risk the cork falling off, and if that happens, well, it's not going to be fun fixing it. Once everything was basically in place, I went round with the silicone sealant again, just to fill in any small cracks and just to make sure that the cork was definitely stuck down fully. Siliconing finished, I let the vivarium sit for 24 hours just in this state, so that I could turn it over the next day and continue with the process. The following day, I flipped the vivarium onto its side so that I could start making the bit of the background that was going to go onto the right hand side of the enclosure as you look at it. Again, I spent a very long time making sure that where I had the pieces arranged was where I wanted them to stay, because once I've put them there, again, I cannot move them. Having settled on an arrangement, I used some duct tape and also some string to fix the more vertical pieces in place, using the previous day's work as a support. Then after this, I moved on to siliconing and waited for a week so that it was all dry before I continued with the build. Now, waiting for a week is maybe a bit excessive in some circumstances, but I had a week to spare, and it's always good to do it to make sure that all of the vinegary smell is gone, and just to make sure that the silicone has sealed properly, because getting any moisture on it before it's sealed can be detrimental to the whole process. A week later, the build continued with making the drainage layer. I'm using a sort of egg crate light diffuser thingy. I just ordered it on Amazon from All Pond Solutions as a seller, and what I'm going to do with it is make a sort of cuboidal type shape to create a void that water can drain into. The majority of this piece was held together with cable ties, although in the middle there were some little joint things that I just had to push together. In order to prevent substrate falling into this void, I wrapped it up with some weed control fabric, again using cable ties and making the holes using a little wooden toothpick. Believe it or not, this little piece of pipe with holes drilled in it will become really useful in the future to allow me to drain the drainage layer, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but never mind, in case it does get waterlogged, so that my substrate won't go stagnant and soggy. Drainage layer prepared, I put some clay balls or leca or leaker, whatever you want to call it, down the sides to fill in those extra gaps and also to provide more drainage. Then the last part of the drainage layer was putting a layer of Lucky Reptile Hydro Fleece on top, again just to make sure that that void and all of the drainage area was completely separate to the substrate I'm going to make in a second. Now for this build I'm going to be making my own substrate mix courtesy of Serpa Design's recipe, which contains 2 parts sphagnum moss, 1 part of fine orchid bark, 1 part of coconut fibre, which was absolutely refusing to come out of the pot, and finally 1 part, or a bit less than a part, of fine gravel or grit. This was mixed together thoroughly to ensure an even consistency. You obviously don't want any big clumps of sphagnum moss or big clumps of gravel in there because the plants really are not gonna like that. This was the end result, and it smelt and looked really earthy, so hopefully it'll do the job really well. Before adding the substrate, I put down a layer of activated carbon pellets. You can use charcoal for this, but I had loads of activated carbon lying around that I was never going to use for anything else, so even though it's quite expensive, I went ahead and used it. After filling the enclosure with substrate, one of the most important parts of the build came up, and this was adding rehydrated sphagnum moss to the cracks between the cork pieces on the background. It's important that you shove these in really tight if you're doing this method, and otherwise they can fall out. Now you can use expanding foam instead, but honestly I like the way this looks better even though it is a little bit harder. And the final step of the entire process was to add the plants to the vivarium, and they are basically what make it a vivarium in the first place. Now, this is pretty much it for the build, but I do have a bit of footage, so I'm just going to let this play out and let you enjoy seeing the final bits of this enclosure take shape. So I will see you in a second, and I hope you enjoy it. So there we have it, the build is finally finished. Now in total this took me like a fortnight to do, and I was only actually working on it for 2 days in that fortnight, but I spent pretty much all day each time making them. And once again I would like to thank DMS Vivaria and Skylight for sending me the enclosure and light, because without that I obviously wouldn't have been able to do this. Hopefully in not too long I'll be coming at you with an update on this when I'll have added the inhabitants, but until then that's the end and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.